Good morning, everybody. First and foremost, I have to say thank you for inviting me here. We were talking earlier about how we're recovering what is modernly called networking, so it's really great to be able to share with all of you a conference in which we're here all together once again. The first thing that I need to say is that over the last 25 to 30 years that I've been working on this area, the most that I've managed to do is what I'm going to tell you to know. So what I'm going to tell you is a summary of what I've learned, of what we know about this subject, and we're going to try to share it with you, and from the viewpoint of how public job centres, employment services work. It's not an econometric discourse, but basically the cornerstones to improving employability. How can we work with those people that are seeking a job or want to improve their job? And at the same time, how can we help companies in their processes and everything that they do for job creation? The first thing that we need to say is what the Congress did. What was the goal of this? To pinpoint innovation, integrative innovation, i.e. they deal with everything together, trying to see everything within a overall framework of a job itinerary, and at the same time accept a vision that goes beyond the typical vision that we have when we structure services, which is a program that actually is divided up into territories, but rather have an overall look and trying to get the user, and the user in this case is the person, the job seeker, and the company right at the center of what we do. But the first thing that happened is how can we understand the fact that this is a very complex situation? Employment isn't just one more variable in the economy, as the theoreticians say. It's more than that. It's a whole series of individual, personal decisions that people take about their career, what they decide to study, what their professional goals are, what companies do, what their activities are, where do they feel they have their competitive edge, what the social partners say, and how they have a role in the decision-making process. And of course, the public administration at the regulation level and service provision level. So all of this goes together to make up something very complex and adaptive, because everybody does something depending on what the other person does. So depending on what the regulation says, the companies decide one thing, or depending on what one person does, the person next to them will decide what they should do. So everything is related, everything is interrelated. It's not just complex in its own right, therefore the whole process, not just talking about independent interlocutors, but they actually interact with each other. That's why we talk about something which is both complex and adaptive. Each screen, what I'm going to try to show you is somebody that's thought about this issue. In this case, it's Arthur Batron, who talks about navigating complexity. It's an idea that dates from the 1990s. What we have to do is to navigate complexity. That means understand it and adapt what's there to our decision-making process. But the problem is that the decision-making process is very, very complex. We can't just talk about a volatile, ambiguous surrounding. We've got further than that. It's far more complex than that. It's the Bani surroundings. And the conclusion of this context is that there's no magic solution, there's no magic recipe. What we've actually learned from all of this is that there isn't one-size-fits-all response. We're going to have to adapt. It's also important to look at some references I've put at the bottom of the screen. When you've got some time, have a look at these. These studies, for example, the impact of automation on employment, because that has an impact on the labour market. Very inspiring book. The new forms of work, non-conventional jobs, collaborative work that are on the limits, the fringes of employment, and of course the impact of technology. There's a recent study such as this one, 10 emerging technologies from another group. These are just reference points that we can refer to. So we've got this complex overview and this need to accept the challenge that we don't know very much, that there are many limits to our decision-making process. Let me just have a look at what I think we can do. And here, with the permit of use, those are listening, I'm looking at the public employment service. So what can a public employment service do with all of this complexity? Well, the first thing that it can do is just do away with this idea that everybody else should invent. I think that's an initial mistake. Somebody will give me the ideas of what I have to do and I'll copy them. Okay, that works to a certain point. Benchmarking works. But you actually need to innovate within the organization itself. I think it's really vital, just in the same way that we ask companies, businesses to be innovative. We think public employment services should be innovative as well. Things that in the business environment are heard a lot, such as high-performance group, accelerators, pilot projects, should start actually sounding familiar to public employment services, talking about disruptive approaches, etc., something different. So the first thing we need to do is to ourselves be innovative in the way we work public. An efficient, inclusive market starts with the improvement of public employment services. This is something that I've said, but it's inspired on a critical way of thinking about the role of what workplace institutions can do when trying to help people find employment. We need to be able to assess, learn, and offer everything we can to those that are job seeking. So what do I mean when I talk about trying to innovate some things in the employment service? I'm going to concentrate on just some of them. Some of them are probably a little bit obvious, I imagine, the way you see it. There are new services, new programs, that's quite obvious. There's a whole set of services, range of services which come, this services portfolio, and there's probably a services portfolio not just from Europe but also from Lambide, which actually reflects the specific nature of the Basque Country. Of course there are new programs, obviously there are. Just a month ago a royal decree was issued regulating the programs for employment. So there's a new conceptual definition and a design of program structure, of the program and structures of the National Employment Service. So quite clearly there's this first level of innovation which is related to the changes in the service and the programs that we implement. But I don't want to go into too much depth about that for now, because we don't have that much time. There's a second level of innovation related to personalization. You need to be able to adapt your programs and services to the job seeker, to that person's personal views, with an overall view, their social problems, their learning difficulties, the limits that they have to travel, to leave people taking care of their children, for example, to be able to go out and train. Of course, this conditions what public employment services can offer and requires innovation to solve these issues of personalization and a holistic view of things. But I want to concentrate on one thing, which is the results orientation that we do. this fourth idea has got still a lot to do. We still carry out assessment, which is basically based on management data, and what we actually need are real impact assessment. Here, I'd like to launch an idea. For a long time now, people have been looking into analyzing the impact of each element of the process respectively. That is breaking down what we're doing, assess the different elements of what we're doing and doing it all the time. How it's impacted the people that have taken part in this service and those that haven't taken part in this service. I think that around assessment there's a lot to be done, still a lot to be innovated in public employment services. That's why I wanted to stop just a moment there. And I also want to talk about the final point, not because these two are more important, but actually because I think these are things that always just end up at the end of the list. We start out with personalization, with this holistic approach, and we never get to assessment and a cooperative approach. What do I mean by a cooperative approach here? Cooperative approach is because that's the only way you can adapt to the system's complexity. We don't operate exclusively from the public sector, nor exclusively from the private sector. So we need to add all these different territorial levels, the different districts, municipalities, regionals, and we need to also add to those that operate locally by reaching agreement or by doing a shared management, using a figure which I will talk about shortly, which are concerted action. And this is a European model and has been up and running since 2050. We also need to learn and trial by doing, but doing that internally, driving internally what we said earlier, generators, public pilot projects and disruptive elements in our value chain. What's more, we need to also include bench learning, not because the European network of employment services says so, but because it's vital that each public employment service, each of the operators that are here, because here you've got local operators, you've got town councils, you include these elements of bench learning and benchmarking to your everyday jobs. There are some things that are different, for example, the case of the OECD, the case of the European network of employment services, the case of bodies in Spain, performance assessment, which the European Investment Bank carried out, looking at what could be done for youngsters and the long-term unemployed. But these are just examples. These bench learning and benchmarking activities, I think, should be broadened to all the organisation without any kind of limitation. And finally, as I said earlier, the projects of the evaluation, participation projects, that the whole project itself is. But just as important as this is the action that's taken. We're not just here to pinpoint things, just to think about things and to learn things, but to do things. This idea of doing, that is a plan, do, check and act, but act again and again, and to get excellence and continuous improvement. What are the key elements of innovation in this field? The first thing is that decision planning tends to be based on data. When I started working in this area in the 1990s, it was complex because data were difficult to get hold of, very scattered, very diverse, but that's not true anymore. We virtually have all our processes digitized now. We've got sufficient information now, but then how do we include these data in the decision-making process, choose the right ones, and not just put them into a machine so that the machine tells us what we have to do, but rather analyze them in a consistent way, and so that decisions are as much as possible based on empirical decision. Then we need to prioritize our user. Then to do what we're most comfortable with, what we've always done, all the services that we've always been offering, this dynamics of inertia. Of course, there's some things that need to be followed by inertia, but we need to think about the end user. We're talking about a service that we offer. The public employment services are service structures. They provide services in collaboration with third parties, but it's not just a service that makes recommendations or publishes regulations. No, it provides services. So we need to make these services priority and make them person-centered and get a holistic view of their needs. And also take some integrated views of things. We tend to separate different elements, and they can't always be separated. Of course, administrative skills mean that some areas are dealing with economy, others are dealing with training. That's all related to the administrative structure, but an administrative structure doesn't reflect reality. Reality is completely different. Reality is very complex. The same person who may be receiving protection is also an active member of the labour market. So this idea of training and education for employment as a continuum, not just this idea of lifelong learning, but the transitions that people have during their working lives. And then the idea of employability and entrepreneurship as a mix. That is the mix between the self-employed and being employed by other people. And I've said this on many occasions, it's increasingly scattered, and the collaboration models, especially in the digital economy and the service economy, is very flexible in this field. So these divisions that we have between training and employment, between employability and entrepreneurship, I think need to disappear, need to become more transparent. And a few proposals to get down to the nitty-gritty. I've divided them into three groups regarding services, programs, and resources. First, regarding services, we need to be consistent with what we've said earlier. We've said that we want this to be user-centered, we want to personalize, and the first thing we need to do is to develop tools that allow us to do that. I've got to get the tools that will allow me, just like a doctor needs a diagnosis, different diagnosis for each patient, and tools to deal with each patient's ailments, because we're not creating statistics, we're dealing with the patient. The same goes for public employment services. We need tools that can help us drill down into the user's profile. That goes from employability to competence assessment, from profiling, so as to group together people that have similar goals, to a careers guidance workshop to try to identify the specific goals and limitations as well of these people, to get tools that help us personalize and adapt services. That's the first idea. The second idea is use an analytical accountability model. We can't assess abstractly. We also need to assess costs, efficiency, not just the data of how many people have got a job, but how much that is taken, how much money, how much of an effort. And the only way of doing that is use measurable units. Let's look at physical units so that we can look at modules, training modules, education models, careers guidance models. But to do that, we need to break down our actions, our processes into actions, into certain actions. The cost of attention, that's to be more efficient. This model of analytical accountancy is going to help us compare different services, and we need to get these tools in public services in the same way that companies do when they actually analyze things. We also need to digitalize processes. It's important that these processes can be adapted to a territory via the final element, which is the way we include, when we provide service provision. What you want is stable frameworks. You can't have a program that starts and that starts and ends. We need to professionalize everything, and this means that we need to create stable frameworks.
Recently, the World Bank looked into the work of Australia when planning their specific action for 4 years. They did it for 2 years, now they plan for 4 years. This means collaborating entities have a framework of 4 years that allows them to plan their resources. An employment system can professionalize these resources not in 3 months but for 4 years, and it has an added effect, and that it generates stability in those that work in this kind of policies. Another element in programs, and I'm not going into adapting to the territory, that's enhancing a mutual learning. This cannot end in the public employment service. It needs to incorporate the entities involved and everyone in the value chain. They need to participate in the benchmarking and other models. And then there's another main element, and that is our team. And I will take this last 2 minutes to focus on this. It's not only a problem of skills or attitude, but also context. The team needs to not only have support, but also incentives regarding innovation. We have to award disruption and innovation. This means public employment services need to change the way in which they work, but probably also their structure, have a more functional structure in which we look at innovation. Who is planning? Who is assessing? Many times in employment services, it's not so clear. And it's very important to have these elements. Because of the health it has, the organic structure divided into functions and their incentives for innovation, I believe it's a core element to change this public employment services. And one last idea that I express, and this is not a science fiction, but it could be something that we wish for in our Christmas letter, and it has to do with the model used in businesses. It's difficult to speak about employment only from a theoretical and academic viewpoint. Employment is functional. It exists to provide services or generate goods. It happens in a specific context, and in this context it has the approach that theorists of economy call the functional approach, that adapts to all production entities in a different way. They are not all the same, but they are similar. Organizations tend to have very close units, logistics, planning, maintenance, quality, different units, areas or departments. And we need to understand that logic, because it's the only way in which the conversation with the companies makes sense. If not, and if you will allow me to say so, it won't make sense at all. We're trying to define specific job descriptions, and they're going to be oriented to goods and services working in a functional manner. Recently, working in a different country, in Mexico, specifically interviewing business people, they gave me this view. This is Mexico. It could be Spain, but it's Mexico. They gave me a view of what are the critical functions and the critical skills in specific sectors. In engineering, in patient care, in mechanical operations, and in digitization, and we could go on and on. There's not that many. Theorician says that there's 16, 20 functions, not more. When I analyze these functions, and I do so taking into account the skills required, I see that they are very far away from the structure that we are providing from public employment services, not only in training, but also in intermediation and classification, and the classification that is used for professions in this system. So we need to evolve towards a common language. That common language is the one maybe promoted by the EU with the European classification? It might be. In my view, it will be this adapted to a specific context. But we need to incorporate this, and we need for our services structure to be known and incorporated. That is, we need specialists in employment, not only in management, that understand the reality of employment in companies. How can we do this? Well, we can have exchange of staff, we can have stays in the companies or specific workshops with clusters and businesses. This will be fundamental, because if not, we will be in two parallel worlds, believing we are speaking about the same thing, that we're all speaking about employment, because in reality we don't know what we're speaking about. And if something has if I've learned something after 25 years, is that no one should think we don't know what we're speaking about. So let's make the effort of understanding each other conceptually and in the use of tools that will be good. So what we need is for a labor market to work better and to be more efficient. So that's what we want to achieve. I will stop here, and I don't know if there's time for questions. Yes, well, first of all, a big round of applause. I see in the first rows the managers that are taking notes, because they are working on this. You gave us many good ideas. I remind you, you have the opportunity to ask a question with the mic, as well as in the cards if you want to write down your question. What really caught my attention, even though Isabel Neira also mentioned this yesterday, she talked about dysfunctions and adaptation process in public employment services to adapt to the business world. But at the end, you said there were parallel worlds. One is the world of business, and the other one of those that in theory should provide the workforce necessary to work in this world. Sara de la Rica has the mic. Sara, you have the floor. Hello, good morning. I really like what you've said. And we're really sorry, but we cannot hear now. It's very interesting to see how you implement this, and he is telling me about all the problems and say, no, this means changes in so and so, this means in the public function that you go, and they say this cannot be. So they are talking to me about all the different problems, and they've told me about 7 or 8. So you've given us a lot of information. Can we go one step further? What do we do with all the Lambida structure that can't be changed? When you need to employ someone, you have to go to the program contract that also provides problems. I know it's a complex question, so maybe we could employ Jaime as the manager, and he can change everything. Well, you would have to change the climate in Vitoria. I'm sorry, I'm joking. I was just joking. Sarah, we know each other. We've met in the virtual world, which is like not knowing each other, but we have been in common webinars recently, and we've talked about our profile. In fact, I've taken notes of what you've said in different webinars. Well, I see an advantage and an inconvenience. First of all, I work with the World Bank, and I realize that there's problems that any public service of employment or Lambida has, is the problems that everyone faces, the French, the German, all Latin American countries, they all are facing the same problems. So this is part of life. And also companies also have structural problems, mobility problems, problems regarding the collective bargain to be for everyone or only for one sector. That's part of the job, but we should not lose sight of the core, and that is understanding what we need to get done. The other stuff will be solved. Of course, it faces complexities. To have functional design is complex. The workers are involved. There are limitations regarding legislation. That's obvious. But if we're able, and if we have a good functional diagnosis, a good orientation of what the functions are, that's why I showed this graph at the end, which is that companies try to do. They don't try and solve everything. They go to the critical issues first. And this is what we do. Don't tell me absolutely everything you do. I know you do accounting, but this is not a critical part. I know you do administration tasks, but that's not critical. When you go to the managers and you ask about what's core in their activity, they say 7 things. The core thing is logistics, or user attention, or manufacturing chairs. If they have the capacity of having a differential functional analysis, we also have it. What's the core? What are the main services? What's what you have to do? Orient, intermediate, help companies in their human resources when getting new workers. That's the what we need to focus on. Of course, we need to manage other stuff too, but this is the core thing, and resources have to go there, and critical skills have to go there too. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. It's never perfect. But if we're able to know what's the core and what are the main critical functions required, then we will be closer. I believe that's my advice, to focus. There's another question. Hello, good morning. I don't know if it's more a question or a comment for whomever needs to listen to this. We work in a municipality employment service. We work directly with the users. So the reality we get to see is a first-hand reality and up close and personal. So what I see is that political decisions, financial resources, implementation, and means do not respond to my needs. It is true that we don't work with the general population. We work with people in vulnerability situations. So many of the things that you are saying, and I really liked your talk, but many of the things that were said yesterday, I reflect on how I could implement it, or how I provide a response to digitization when my main aim is real literacy. Or we have many users that don't know how to multiply, for example. And this is real life. This is what we are facing. The complementary resources to improve employability of these people offered by the autonomous region, and I'm not from the Basque Country, I must say so. I don't work in the Basque Country. They don't respond to the needs of my users, and they tell me, well, this is the resources you have to work it, and that's it. So you have to reflect on how you can improve employability if the resources you have available are not the ones needed. So I do believe there is a need of being listened at a political level to those that are in direct contact with the users. That we are listened to before implementing resources, that they get to know what are the real needs and not the needs that are talked about in the management level. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Yes. I believe there are several things here. I've really learned collaborating with companies that provide services to town councils. For example, the City Forums for Employment works with the local governments, and we look into what is demanded and what are the resources, and this is a very interesting learning process. How do I believe this can be solved? First thing, we need to have a conceptual basis, and as we're not going to develop this here, I'm just going to sketch it very quickly. This conceptual basis needs to understand that the complexity of the market is also present in the users, in the people. Experts that work in human resources will know about multiple intelligences by Howard Gardner from the 80s and 90s. So we need to understand that people are very different, need different things, have different skills, and behave in different ways, and also have different objectives. Therefore, it's always going to be necessary to adapt to the user. How do we do this? So that the means provide you this differential response. The only way of doing this, I believe, is through a figure that is difficult to explain, and that is trust. Trust means that the manager, you need to trust the entity, and so you need to adapt to the resources and the program to those specific features. I believe employment services and programs sometimes are very rigid. They need to be more flexible. And not because we want to have more budgetary flexibility, but because this is the demand, because the users are different. We need to finish here, if not we're taking time from the rest of speakers, but I believe there's one more question, and I will ask you to please be brief. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation full of know-how, and I share this because I've been working on this for many years. Where do we start? I think right now we're creating here a very interesting ecosystem in the Basque country. We've worked a lot in management, and we see that the changes starts in yourself from the inside of each organization. So don't you think it would be interesting to use the idea of pilots, what is done in Europe? Because we're not going to transform absolutely everything in Lambide. So let's no organization transforms suddenly. It's a very long and complex process. So shouldn't we start with a small pilot with good people that already have the right ideas, the know-how in all dimensions? Because you've talked about understanding personalized services for young people, businesses, understanding the language management, data assessment. It's so complex that it brings me to one conclusion, and I would like to know if you share this idea. And it's the idea of creating pilots and work with a bottom-up approach with one of our allies that in the government, and monitor it and see if that way we can change things. Yes, I fully agree. And I believe that's the first thing I've said. The innovation context has to be created. The innovation context has rules. You have them in companies. They're called accelerators or high performance group. We can use this term or another one, but at the end of the day, we're speaking about the same thing. Controlled elements, pilot projects, limited in time and number of users, from which we can obtain experience. They can be assessed and later on be expanded. This is basic. These high performance groups or pilot groups, as the European methodology says or calls them, have to be not only created, but we need to, doesn't have to be a top-bottom approach. We need to have the capacity of the people working in training, orientation, and so on and so forth, put forward projects. It's not only that the organization decides to do so. And I have to say one more thing. There are specific dynamics to do this. SEPE in its activation strategy has created the orientation digitalization, innovation, and entrepreneurship centers that are based on this. They're generating an ecosystem to do this. We're generating opportunities. And Bidchen also responds to this logic, for what I know. So now there is a context in which this is possible. It is true that with the pandemic, the volume of users makes things difficult, but as soon as the situation is normalized, when we're in a normal labor market situation, it's when we need to promote it, because now we have the means to do it. Technology, collaborative work, even if you're not there, allows you to do this. Before you had to move people, that move them to different places. Now it's not necessary. You can have a high performance group with a collaboration of people that are in 7 different employment offices. We did a pilot in orientation like this in the Basque Country, and I believe it's fundamental. And one last question, it's more a comment. The assessment of the resource can be biased with a bad selection of citizens regarding the resource. Maybe the resource is good, but not adequate for that specific person, or the situation of that person changes. This is something that Sarah should answer, but yes, that's why profiling is so important. You cannot measure things for just anyone. You have to do it for those where it works better. So we need differential comparisons, not of an abstract resource, but of a resource with a specific target. And I finish with this. Maybe the nuance is that we thought of profiling as a tool that is too statistic and that you work with beforehand. But this is not the way in which things work. Of course, you need to have a previous analysis, but then the system has to incorporate the features and these elements, and that is what's the function that works better for this profile. This is what's essential. What's the best service for this homogeneous target group? This is the only way in which a profile makes sense. If not, people are just labeling one way, whether it's correct or not for them. So we create these groups, but then we adapt this situation with this continuous improvement idea, so that we apply the best measures and services. That's the way in which we will work. Jaime López, thank you.
Muchas gracias.